didn't know at that stage that I didn't have a choice, and it was actually an immediate deportation order that they had. So we went to the Bureau of Immigration. I was there for ages, and then I said, what's happening? And that's when, you know, you got told, well, you don't have to say anything, blah, you know, the usual blah, blah, blah. And you've been joining rallies, and you're an undesirable alien, and you're to be deported immediately. It didn't happen because, fortunately, I had a lot of friends. I didn't know I had so many friends until this happened, but it's been wonderful from that point of view. So lots of people came into the Bureau of Immigration, including lawyers, the people I worked with, some bishops, some priests, some religious, farmers, fisherfolk. People just came. So they basically couldn't deport me at that stage. But they wouldn't let me go home either. And I'd said to them I didn't have my passport. It was with the travel agent, but I did have a Xerox copy of that and the visa. But they said, no, you're undocumented, you don't have a passport, which they told me I didn't need. It was only later that we worked out why, when the President gave a speech about 2 days later at the turnover of the military command. And he went into a tirade for about 30 minutes. I won't tell you what he called me, apart from foul-mouthed, a neoliberal professing same-sex marriage, and goodness knows, like, it just went on and on and on. And then we knew why I wasn't allowed to go home that night. So that was a great saga. But it all happened, really. What triggered it all was there's martial law in Mindanao, and they were trying to say martial law is a good thing. Now, I was volunteering with the Agricultural Workers Union at that stage, and I knew a lot of the situation of the agricultural workers, and it's just terrible. They get underpaid, unsafe conditions, sometimes whole families have to work to get the quotas. And so I was working with them, but there's a lot of people, because the basic underlying issue is the farmers don't have their own land. And the land is being taken for mining, and the land is being taken for expansion of plantations, all of which, apart from being ecologically destructive, displace the people, particularly tribal people. And so that is the basis of what was happening. We were hearing a lot of stories of people who came into Manila, and they were horrific, like 2 young fellows, I think one was 17, one was 21. I met them, we went to the Commission on Human Rights with them. They lived down south in Targum, a town down south. They were farmers, but when there was no farming, one of the uncles had a small-scale mining thing. So they were helping on that, and they'd got a salary and had gone to the main city to spend it. They were arrested by the police, accused of shoplifting, which there was no evidence for. Then the military came and took them to the military camp. They were tortured for 5 days, hit with wood and all sorts of things, to admit they were New People's Army. Now, there's been a liberation movement in the Philippines called the New People's Army for about 50 years now. They were accused of being New People's Army, which they weren't. They were simple farmers. When they didn't admit that, they were taken up the mountain. The military thought they'd strangled them. They still had marks on their throats. They were thrown into a pit with wood and leaves thrown on top, and then a flame thrown in. Now, fortunately, it didn't catch very well, and they weren't dead like the military thought, and they managed to get out and run. One of the military who saw them running, his gun didn't work. So they told me that, you know, where they ran to get home would normally take 3 days, and they did it in one day. I think the adrenaline was bad, but the burns on them were horrific. And so that case has been taken to the Commission on Human Rights. That was one of the stories. Another one was some lumads. Now, the lumad's a general term for Indigenous people in Mindanao. a couple of them were up in Manila, families of victims of a massacre. The leader who happened to be also killed and was the father and the husband of a couple in Manila to tell the story. They had already had some of their land taken by a coffee plantation, and the coffee plantation wanted to expand, and they were, he was a tribal leader, and they didn't want it to expand, so there was opposition. Now they were opened fire on, and 8 of them were killed. So, you know, these were the sort of stories we were hearing of people. There were lots of people, and there are lots of people, particularly farmer leaders, tribal leaders, church people even, who have come to Manila because it's too dangerous now down in Mindanao. They can't move. They've got false charges. They're, you know, because that was the other thing, lots of people being arrested. So what we did, different organisations of farmer groups, fisherfolk, religious, academe, who come together. There's this group, Patria, which is basically a defence of the land. We organised a fact-finding. There were some people from overseas, mostly from Asian countries, and myself. But I was the Philippine delegate. And we went down, and I was assigned to Davao, which is where Duterte comes from. And down there, we interviewed the families of some of those who'd been killed. And normally it was because they were trying to defend the land against the encroachment of mining and plantations. Some were environmentalists, some were tribal leaders. So we heard the stories of the families and how often they were shot in front of their children, they were dragged away, you know, just horrific sort of stories. We interviewed farmers and workers who were invited to the military camp on the thing that they were going to have a seminar or they were going to be given rice. The next morning they discovered that they were rebel returnees. And it's all, I mean, the part of the propaganda is the military say there's hardly any, and then they have all these returnees who are not. So, but it's all harassment. And again, it's people who are organising. We talked to the Lumad who had come down from a place called Talaingod in the mountains, that when I was in the Rural Missionary, we had helped set up a series of schools in the mountains. They had walked 3 days down to this other, where we were staying, because what happened was, they've been militarised for ages, but it's got worse. And what the ultimatum was, they either join the Alamara, which is a tribal group trained and armed by the military, basically to kill. So they either had to join that, or they were presumed they belonged to the New People's Army. Neither of which they want, you know, neither of which was true, and neither of which options they were taking. So they went higher into the mountain, which they'd done before, thinking when it cools down a little bit, they can come back. Well, what happened was the military had a food blockade, so they couldn't get food up. So they travelled down to the lowlands, and we were talking to them there. And it was really interesting. As soon as they got there, the children started their school. The Lumad children so much want education, but there's something like 50-something have been closed out of the 100-something schools now, with military either bombing, taking over the area, setting up camp in their school grounds. So these people, and there were 2 who gave birth when they arrived, so the babies were only 1 day old when I arrived there. So I'm thinking, these women have been up there for days, and then they've just given birth.